Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second annual McGill Max Bell Lecture Series. Bonsoir et bienvenue à la deuxième série annuelle des conférences McGill Max Bell. My name is Andrew Potter. I am the interim director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy. The Max Bell School of Public Policy and McGill University are situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory in which peoples of the world now gather. I'd like to now invite McGill's Dean of Arts, Lisa Shapiro, to come up and say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Je m'appelle Lisa Shapiro. Je suis la doyenne de la Faculté des Arts à l'Université McGill. My name is Lisa Shapiro, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. I want to thank everyone for joining us here today for the Montreal portion of this lecture series. It's wonderful to be here all together, and it's so great so many of you could come today. Since its beginning, 5 years ago, the Max Bell School has encouraged bold thinking amongst its students, preparing them for various careers in public policy and governmental and not-for-profit organizations. Depuis ses débuts, il y a maintenant 5 ans, l'École de politique publique Max Bell encourage les idées audacieuses et novatrices de ses étudiantes, toutes en leur offrant une base solide pour diverses carrières en politique publique, ainsi qu'au sein d'organismes gouvernementaux et à but non lucratif. The Max Bell School hosts a variety of annual events and lectures, and they are part of what makes the student experience very distinctive. This also demonstrates a strong commitment to public outreach. As with many events that I've attended in the past, I look forward to yet another insightful discussion this evening. Cette série de conférences annuelles de l'École Max Bell en est déjà à sa 2e édition. Elle nous offre une occasion précieuse d'aborder plusieurs sujets liés à des enjeux économiques critiques pour un avenir plus prospère au Canada. Last academic year, we inaugurated this lecture series, which was made possible in a large part thanks to the generous support of Mr. Thomas Kierans, who is unfortunately unable to join us this evening. An alumnus of McGill, Tom Kierans holds a BA honors and is one of Canada's most respected business leaders, the director and chairman of many successful national and international companies. He provided national leadership in public policy research and development for over 25 years, such as in his role as president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute, cementing the organization's reputation as a leader among Canadian think tanks. We're so grateful for Mr. Tom Kierans for this foundational gift, and I wish you all a great event and a great discussion this evening. Thank you, merci et bonne soirée, and I will turn it back to Andrew to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Dean Shapiro. These McGill Max Bell lectures are probably the marquee event at the policy school. And as Dean Shapiro noted, we owe a great debt to Mr. Tom Kierans for funding these. But I also understand that when Mr. Kierans first brought the idea of the series to Max Bell's then director, Chris Reagan, the focus was expected to be on having better debates about Canadian fiscal policy, deficits, debts, taxes, and so on. But over the course of their subsequent discussions, they agreed to a slightly broader focus on economic policy more generally. And hence the subtitle of this series is Economic Ideas for a Stronger Canada. So I'd like to take a quick moment here to give thanks to Chris for his work in bringing these lectures to life and for setting in motion what I think we all expect will be a significant part of his enduring legacy at Max Bell as its founding director. The vision for these lectures is to highlight a crucial policy issue for the Canadian economy, but the series is also designed to serve as a platform for thinkers who are not yet household names, but who have achieved a level of accomplishment and respect in their specific areas, such that the public interest would be served by a wider promotion of their ideas. And also, finally, the vision of this series is to publish simultaneously with the lectures a book that promotes the main themes and arguments of the authors in a manner that's accessible to the broader public. Our publishing partner again this year, for the second year in a row, is Sutherland House under the direction of Mr. Ken White. Sutherland's professionalism and commitment to the project has made possible the very fast turnaround of the manuscript into the finished book, which I believe most of you should be holding in your hands right now. This year's lectures are being given by Denise Hearn and Vass Bednar, and their theme is how corporate concentration is growing across many Canadian industries. When Canadians complain about high grocery prices, cell phone rates, and banking fees, what we're really talking about is corporate power. But beyond the grocers, the telecoms, and the banks, more and more of the Canadian economy is being controlled by only a handful of big companies, and everything from funeral services to fertilizer. And last week in Vancouver, Vass and Denise talked about the rise and growth of these everything companies. In tonight's session, they will discuss the role of the government in freeing markets. We often think of regulatory red tape as getting in the way of an entrepreneur's success, but increasingly, the largest companies themselves are acting as private regulators, controlling the infrastructure of commerce, setting market rules in their favor, and stifling innovation. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Vass Bednar and Denise Hearn to deliver tonight's lecture, The Government's Role in Freeing Markets, Challenging Corporate Red Tape. So, to introduce them, Vass Bednar is the Executive Director of McMaster University's Master of Public Policy in Digital Society program. Her work focuses on the intersections between policy and the innovation ecosystem. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and she writes the popular newsletter, Regs to Riches. She's also a contributing columnist to the Globe and Mail's Report on Business and hosts their weekly podcast, Lately, about what is new in the new economy. Denise Hearn is an author, an applied researcher and advisor focused on how economic power and paradigms shape our world. She's a resident senior fellow, at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University. Denise is also the co-author of The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Competition, named a Financial Times Best Book of 2018. After their lecture, they will be joined on stage for a conversation with Justin Ling. He's a freelance journalist who covers politics, security, and lots of other things. He is a contributing columnist to the Toronto Star, a contributor to Wired Magazine, Foreign Policy, and The Walrus, and also the author of a newsletter called Bug-Eyed and Shameless. Vass and Denise, I think Vass, you're both coming up, right? Yeah, Vass first. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dean Shapiro. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Chris Reagan. Thank you also to Adriana Goretta and Victoria Weston, who you saw when you came in. Denise and I also had the privilege of working with two incredible research associates. They're now graduates of the Maxwell School, but Emily Pedden and Sean Selly were Zooming with us on the regular, seeing our scrappy work week to week, and helping bring these ideas to life. So thank you. Government red tape, that sounds boring. And I hear my son, but he is upset that I'm going to talk about red tape. The most famous artist on Spotify is someone you've never heard of. That's right, even the Max Bell students in the room or my younger cousins. He's racked up over 15 billion streams, more than artists like Michael Jackson, Metallica, and Mariah Carey. To put that in perspective, back in 2022, the Puerto Rican rapper Bad Bunny was the most streamed artist on the platform, with 18.5 billion plays, which is just a few billion more. What's a few billion here and there? This mystery artist is everywhere and nowhere. And if you try to search his name, which you can during the presentation, you won't find his profile on any streaming platform. That's because Johan Rohr is not an artist. He's a Swedish composer who has used over 50 different composer pseudonyms to create songs for hundreds and hundreds of fake musicians. Now, Denise and I noticed this back in January. There was a woman online, she goes by the handle Elizabeth Handgun. And I know, thank you, Elizabeth, by the way. We do cite her in the book. She pointed out that there was a playlist. Maybe you've listened to this playlist. I definitely have. It's called Jazz for Reading. And in this playlist, she noticed that a lot of the songs were kind of acoustically identical, and that none of the artists' photos or pictures showed up. They didn't have a presence when you tried to find out who they actually are. And this led her to an expose in a Swedish newspaper that found Johan. And even though he's an EDM composer, he may be using computer programs to generate music, right? This is a person who intentionally uses fake music accounts to disguise his identity, deceive us as listeners, and this gets put into Spotify playlists that are curated, partially by us, sure, if you're somebody who takes that kind of active role, but more often than not, curated for us by these platforms. We don't know for sure how often he's using AI to generate his music, but we know that he's a precursor to other kinds of synthetic media. None of these singers are real. Korean pop girl bands like Eternity, no E actually, 2 I's if you want to look them up, and Maeve have videos that have racked up millions and millions of views on YouTube. And that's significant because it affects their payout. So Eternity is a band of 7 women who provide a sort of pixelated puppet show. They are artificially generated just like their music, their personalities, their faces, their fashion, and their songs. Last year, their debut single, Pandora, very ironic name, went viral, right? Passing over 10 million views. Now, what kind of payout would that have gotten for, say, a human artist? It's actually impossible to know because of the black box of these algorithms, but it would be somewhere between $2,500, not a lot of money, or $40,000, which is probably still not a lot of money for 10 million views. And that sort of reinforces how these algorithmically curated payouts also depress wages for workers. This money could have gone to musicians. Instead, it went to the shareholders and executives of a computer program. And some of that other money went to Johan. This is an example where more competition isn't actually better. More fake news, more synthetic video, more synthetic audio, which is increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to detect. Now, Denise and I hear a very simple solution, pretty much I'm going to say all the time. There's a lack of competition in Canada. There's a lot of corporate concentration. So what do we need? Easy. More competition. But A, how do you actually get that? We get at that in the book, and we'll talk about it a little bit with Justin. But also, more of the same, more of certain kinds of competition isn't necessarily better. Now, the infusion of generative AI matters, not just in cultural industries, but in cultural industries in particular. It deceives us, right? We get tricked. It's not really fair. Who knows what you've already listened to when you thought you were supporting a cool new band, or just trying to listen to some jazz for reading. It displaces earnings for authentic musicians, which is something Canada, from a policy standpoint, has taken a particular position on recently. And it also creates a real risk for workers' rights. In fact, this kind of substitution is exactly what the Hollywood writers' strike was predicated on. Now, sometimes these platforms have another interest as we look ahead. And that could be, instead of negotiating with workers, instead of setting a more predictable wage floor, they could actually just get rid of humans altogether. Now, AI influencers are just the beginning of how these new technologies will change market dynamics. Again, they look like people, they're part of false and misleading advertising, they deceive us, but they certainly are some kind of indicator of more going on, right? More competition, but again, what kind? When we talk about market governance, when it makes my toddler cry, we typically talk about regulators as if they impose themselves on these perfect, free, super efficient markets, right? Regulators come and they just bust everything up and kind of get in the way. But rarely do we think about private regulators, right? And algorithms are just one example of this. This is the other red tape that Andrew was telling you we were going to speak about before I was bringing up my Korean pop bands. Now, Denise and I were, what do we do a lot of when we're together? Surf the web and research. And we wanted to look up the history of red tape. Because again, when people talk to us, this is something they like to talk about, and that's totally cool with us. But the other red tape, the one we're not talking about and the one we're certainly not cutting, actually has kind of a fascinating history. In the early 16th century, your friend and mine, King Charles V of Spain, started using red tape to bind really important documents, administrative documents that required immediate attention and discussion by the Council of State. The red tape wasn't used to mess everything up, and the red tape wasn't used to get in the way. The red tape was actually an indicator to separate these priority dossiers from ordinary administrative matters, which were bound with boring regular strings. This practice of using red tape for important governments started to spread. And then it's kind of ironic that a phrase that has come to signify bureaucracy was actually an early innovation in government about stuff that was exciting and important. Check out this transition. Do you know what else is red? Pizza. Pizza sauce specifically was a fact check from Denise when we practiced this. Last week on our initial book tour, and we had a lovely initial lecture in Vancouver, Denise and I used Google search to find an independent bar. Okay, we live our values here. And we're looking at the menu, we're pretty excited, pretty hungry, and we see something on the menu called focaccia. Now, let's be real, we know what focaccia is, but as we got into the fine print and looked at the details, it sounded a lot like pizza. So we had to ask our server for some clarification. And she said, oh yeah, that's actually pizza. And we asked her, well, why don't you call it pizza? Well, it turns out an unnamed pizzeria, major chain, US-owned, buy us a drink after, we'll tell you who it is, was imposing a restrictive covenant on this independent bar because of their local market power. And that restriction said that they can't sell pizza. Now, why would someone do that? Well, we can debate, but these kinds of restrictions, whether they're weird, whether they're wonderful, whether they're micro, are happening more and more in the economy. And some of you watching or some of you in the room may recall a small piece of journalism last year in the Halifax Examiner that revealed, you're shaking your head, no, you don't remember it, but I haven't told you what it revealed yet, so you might remember. It revealed that Sobeys, now I feel comfortable naming the companies because it's out in the open, it revealed that Sobeys was imposing the very same kind of restriction on a local Dollarama in the same plaza because Sobeys also the real estate. Sorry, I won't keep coming back to you, but now you're nodding and I appreciate that. And what it meant was that Dollarama couldn't sell bread. So if you were a price-sensitive consumer who wanted to price comparison or maybe save a little bit on that loaf of bread for your family that week, it couldn't happen in that plaza. Now, that piece of journalism has led to a study at our competition bureau, et cetera, and journalism is very, very important. But at the same time, it's happening in more and more and more of the economy, and as I said, in the most surprising places. Now, I'm going to call up Denise to take us through the next slice.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And who caught Vass's great pun with the slice there? Okay, so I wanted to do a little audience participation. What percentage of all online searches start on Amazon? Does anyone have a guess? Too high. So it's actually 56% in the US. So that means that every time someone gets online and they want to buy a product, they don't necessarily go to Google, they go straight to Amazon. And we don't have similar data in Canada, but we could infer that it's probably around the same percentage. So Amazon is an incredible company, right? It is this middleman through which we access millions and millions of products. Name your favorite. Mine is the thing that you could never find in any other store that Amazon's is gonna have, right? And we just moved, and so it's been very useful to us. So it's really miraculous in a lot of ways. But what are the downsides of a platform like Amazon? Well, if you are an independent seller and you're trying to get your product to us, the consumer, now you have to compete with the very business that you're reliant on to reach customers. Amazon has a number of private label products, so it has a line called Amazon Basics and a number of other brands that they don't disclose, which compete with independent sellers. And not only that, but because as an independent seller, you have to go through Amazon, Amazon knows this, and they've started charging higher and higher tolls on independent sellers. So it operates sort of like this invisible toll booth that the seller, as they're on their way to you, has to pass through the Amazon gate and give them a bunch of money. Well, how much money? There's some research out of a research institute in the US that said that Amazon now takes an average of 45% of every sale made by an independent seller. And that's for things like advertising fees. They charge what's called a referral fee, which I had to look up, and it's basically they're referring that seller to you, the customer. So just for the privilege of referral, they take a cut, and also for fulfillment services, so shipping. And what's even more astounding is that seller fees have grown faster than any other part of Amazon's business. So most people, when if they know a little bit about Amazon, they think actually AWS, its cloud storage business, is the real kind of meat and potatoes of the business. But what's interesting is that seller fees are now the second highest source of revenue for Amazon, and AWS is much further behind in slot 3. So that's an example. Amazon is an example. I like how we're leaving pizza up here for as long as possible. But that's an example of, what we call Amazon's toll road. And it's one example of how gatekeepers exist in every single industry. Here's another example. So Google Play and the Apple App Store. We all play Candy Crush. We all have our favorite app on our phone. And anytime that you spend money downloading an app or paying for something in the app, you may not realize, but Apple and Google take 30% of that. And so if you're an app developer, that makes you kind of annoyed. And there's been years and years of organizing efforts. They've tried to get the app stores to lower those commission fees, but they haven't, been as successful as they would like to. So when we think about entrepreneurs starting businesses, we often think that the biggest impediment that they face is access to capital. And access to capital, of course, is huge, especially if you're a female founder. So we know that for the last decade, female founders receive less than 3% of all venture capital money, which makes me want to tear my hair out. So we know that access to capital is very important. But what Vass and I think is equally important, especially as we think about driving innovation, is what we call access to markets. So as soon as a business has the capital, they want to grow, they want to scale, what are the market conditions that they have to face? And I actually helped co-launch an initiative called Access to Markets, where we got to speak to all kinds of different entrepreneurs across the country. We spoke to farmers, we spoke to independent pharmacists, we spoke to Silicon Valley entrepreneurs that were trying to build their own cloud storage businesses. I remember one conversation where I spoke to a farmer who was trying to start a direct-to-consumer meat company. It was called Butcher Box, and you could order straight from local regenerative farms. And what was so interesting is that as he was building his business, which is an amazing business, he found that because the supply chains were so concentrated, the slaughterhouses and the meat packers were so highly concentrated that he couldn't access slaughter space. And so he essentially had to build an entirely new supply chain just to get his business off the ground. And it was so difficult difficult and required so much money to do that that he ended up moving 90% of his business to Australia, where it was less concentrated. So this idea of access to markets is so, so important as we think about spurring innovation. Another one, Alphabet's ecosystem here. So Vass and I, as mentioned in Vancouver, we talked about everything companies, and the tech firms are sort of, the quintessential everything companies. So when you think about Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, not only, of course, do they have search, they have about 90% of all online search, but they have ads, Google Cloud. They're a leader in AI and machine learning. They also have their own venture capital and corporate venture capital, hardware and consumer electronics like Fitbit, health and life sciences, transport and navigation, media, mobile operating systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at this, you see a company that isn't just dominant in one industry. It's really interested in collecting assets across industries and becoming what Jeff Bezos at Amazon called a flywheel, where he would, where essentially these collections of assets sort of reinforce each other. And so if you think about it, if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to pick an industry, how do you go up against an everything company that can use its free cash flow from one part of its business to kind of enter into and start to dominate more and more and more industries? And as I mentioned, the tech firms have been so successful at this that they're now called the Magnificent Seven. So that's Apple, Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Tesla. And they actually accounted for 31% of all S&P 500 value last year, which is just remarkable. And to put that in perspective, that combined market capitalization passed $13 trillion, which was more than the entire Chinese index, and more than the Canadian, British, and Japanese equity exchanges combined, just those 7 companies. So they've been incredibly successful at this sort of everything company approach. And part of the reason for that concentration of value is because we've also shifted. The economy has really shifted from, a manufacturing and production economy where we're producing tangible goods to producing intangible goods. And a huge percentage of this S&P 500 value, up to 90% of it now, is actually intangible value. So that's things like patents and trademark and something called goodwill, which I find hysterical because it's essentially the brand, the brand name, how much sort of goodwill does it have in the community to a consumer. And so, that has really changed how markets operate. And I want to go back. Vass gave us some really fun stories at the beginning about algorithms and sort of how it's changing, changing our feeds, changing our social media feeds, our music feeds, and so on. But generative AI, right? I mean, we all now know this word after the last 2 years. We can't avoid it as much as we might like to. And we're in this sort of weird space where we have arguments saying, oh, it's a complete bubble and everyone's overreacting. And then we have Nobel Prize winners saying it's going to be the end of humanity. And we're sort of left to sort out, well, what actually is it? And while those conversations are incredibly important, what we wanted to emphasize was actually that we think, despite generative AI being positioned as this sort of big disruptor, that it's going to massively, unleash innovation and that it's going to change markets as we know them, which of course it will in many ways, that what we think is that it actually has the potential to just entrench some of these Magnificent Seven even further. And one of the reasons for that is because the biggest companies have access to, billions and billions of dollars that they can spend on CapEx, so they can actually invest in data centers. I don't know if you've been reading the news, but they're now actually building their own mini nuclear reactors to power their data centers. They have access to troves and troves of data, and also to the foundational models and the software and the talent. And all of those things combine into this kind of insurmountable position where it's very difficult for other startups to compete. And here, this is really small, so it's not very easy to read, but this shows basically generative AI patents and how much this is just, in the last 10 years, and there's basically a giant rush on AI patents. And what's interesting is that China tends to dominate and Chinese companies, but Google, IBM, and Alphabet and Microsoft are also within sort of the top 10 for patent holders. And so again, this just shows that what they are wanting to do is take up more and more of that innovation ecosystem, more and more of the intellectual property, making it very, very difficult for others to actually get a foothold. And, this is a problem for Canada because Canada actually has fewer entrepreneurs than it did 20 years ago. It's actually declined by 50%, our entrepreneurship rate. And there's many factors for that. We have an aging population. Business owners are retiring. It's maybe more costly to start a business. But we think an underappreciated element is that now, if you're a startup, so much of the innovation landscape is already dominated by some major players. And so it becomes harder and harder to actually have that sort of creative, destructive process that we hear about. Okay, so that seems pretty depressing. So what is our solution to these problems? And we wanted to say that the big fix, we called our book The Big Fix for 3 reasons. So first, markets increasingly feel rigged. They feel fixed, I think, to many people. And we illuminate why in the book. Secondly, the kind of traditional fixes that we hear, so like Vass mentioned, more competition or maybe end supply management or these things that we hear in Canada are not the fixes we hope that they'll be. And then what is our big fix? Well, our big fix is we think that these problems are so large that they really require what we call a whole of government approach. That doesn't mean more red tape. That doesn't mean more unnecessary bureaucracy. What it means is each level of government, every ministry taking an active role in thinking about how it can help markets to essentially level the playing field in their respective industries. And we also think that, the provinces have a unique role to play too, because they are in charge of consumer protection, and they also regulate business activities. And so we think that there's a really natural complement for the provinces to play, and I think we're going to get into more details with Justin as we invite him up. Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'll leave it there.
So listen, I love this book. Yes, I think you should.
Aw, thanks.
Oh, wow. That was not planned. I love this book. It's been a little while now that I've become antitrust pilled, is what the cool kids are calling it now. But listen, there's a one section that I was fixating on when I was leafing through it when I first picked it up. It's
Read along, yeah.
Page 36. It's just a graphic. It's a graphic of TELUS's many sectors. It says more than a telecom. There's phone and internet. We're all familiar with that. There's TELUS, obviously. There's Koodo. There's Public Mobile, which they own. There's Start.ca. There's TELUS Business, delivers business services. They do TELUS Agriculture. TELUS Pollinator Fund for Good, like bees.
Kind of like a venture thing. It's kind of cool.
So it's not actually. I literally thought they were investing in bees. Okay. There's TELUS Ventures, TELUS Health Virtual Pharmacy, which I understand from this book is massive. TELUS Virtual Care, TELUS Health, My Care, TELUS Mental Health Services. I was reading through this and I thought to myself, my God, what a problem. And so I found myself on thehub.ca. There's a fantastic article. All about TELUS and the need to go after the telecommunications monopoly. It's by Sean Spear. It's titled "Imposing Artificial Competition in the Telecom Sector Has Been a Cross-Party Failure. It's Time to Unleash the Market." I scroll to the very bottom of the article, and it says, "This article has been made possible by TELUS and the generosity of readers like you." There's a phrase you use in this book, and it goes, "too big to care." You suggest that many of our oligopolies are just too big. They're so big, they don't care what we think about them anymore. Can you tell me about that? Because that's a really depressing idea.
I'll kick off, maybe. I mean, I was sort of listing my bingo card of what people tend to kind of project onto us, and one of those things is they sort of test us, like, are we going to say that big is bad? So sometimes we get together and, like, right off the top, we're just like, big isn't bad. We don't think that big is bad. And it's not, right? We want Canadian companies to grow. We want them to be big, and the way that many of these firms has evolved is, like, pretty strategic and innovative and thoughtful. But yeah, when you think about how they're evolving and they're in our everyday lives. When TELUS sponsors some thinking around, and to their credit in the hub, this is transparent. And we know that too often this kind of captured research isn't necessarily labeled. Side note, I think we're recording with the hub next week on Wednesday. We did have some debate about participating in the series. Again, it's transparent, but say a foreign competitor were to bust into Canada, how do you compete with a firm like that? Are you competing with a pharmacy? It's our second largest pharmacy benefit manager. I know that always blows your mind. I took that. I'm sorry. You should have said it.
And how many big pharmacy managers do we have?
2.
It's quite-
I mean, side note, there was a competition case that looked at the Vancouver Airport Authority. The big question there was, is 2 competitors enough? And the answer weirdly was yes. So we do kind of have to move away from that a little bit. But I'll turn it to Denise for more on kind of too big to care as one of the bad elements of bigness. But again, it's very difficult to compete directly with a company like that. And our analysis, our kind of econometric analysis for competition is fundamentally predicated on establishing a relevant market, which feels like some of that illusion too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that we like to try to emphasize is that most of us experience either freedom or a lack thereof today in the commercial sphere, right? I mean, we all have mortgages we have to pay, we have rent we have to pay, we have to pay our cell phone bills, and so on and so forth. And we are not against, as Vass said, companies getting big and being successful. What competition policy really is meant to do is to say, how was that success achieved? Was it done by offering great products and services? Or was it done by abusing its dominance, by getting too big to care, treating customers like they don't really have that much time for you, and so on and so forth, or treating workers, poorly and suppressing wages. And so those are the kinds of things that competition policy cares about, and that's the kind of stuff that we care about, because we don't really care about competition for its own sake. Like, competition is meant to do something, and the something is to make our country, a flourishing place to be a consumer, to be a worker, to be a citizen, and to not undermine the kind of rights and freedoms that we all deserve as we participate in markets.
Maybe we can back up even a little scooch here and just talk about the nature of the problem, assuming it is a problem, and I think we probably should assume that. There's that old line you mentioned in the book about Canada being for corporations in a trench coat. And that's always been somewhat true. But you point out that through the process of consolidation, through private equity coming to Canada, through acquisitions and mergers, we've actually seen, maybe it's no longer 4 companies, now it's 3 companies, and, 2 of them are joined at the hip. So tell me a little bit about the state of oligopoly in this country.
I mean, it's not good. People are always shocked. I was shocked when I learned this. So the Competition Bureau, which is our regulator that essentially one of its sole purposes is to review mergers and to potentially block those that they deem illegal, has never successfully blocked one merger in Canada. So how many mergers have we blocked? A big fat 0. Maybe every single merger in and of itself doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but when that happens over decades and decades, and mergers keep, growing, and there's more consolidation across not just banking, not just telecom, not just grocery, but, as was mentioned, fertilizer, funeral homes, insurance, oil and gas, et cetera, that kind of consolidation, that's when you start seeing some of these big problems emerge, where, companies can use that market power in ways that, don't serve Canadians.
Yeah, I think we're still going to try to diagnose where we've been for the last number of years, and then we'll get to the terrifying reality of AI. But it seems to me that even the things that we set up to defend our industries, ostensibly something like supply management, you've still seen the consolidation in those sectors as well. There's kind of a myth now of the down home, family milk farm it largely doesn't exist. You point out there's a stat you use in the book that I think I knew, but it blows my mind. In half of Canadian industries, consolidation has increased 40% over the last 30 some odd years. Like that's a pretty stark consolidation. And I don't think anyone in this country has, at least in recent years, stood up and said, hey, listen, we just have fewer small businesses than we used to, and we should probably do something about it.
I mean, we have fewer than we used to, but I think our economy is still, what, 95, 96% SMEs, so we're still kind of based on this. That stat was from a report Denise mentioned where the Competition Bureau teamed up with Statistics Canada, and that's really important, but sometimes we get a little bit anchored in that problem space or in the trench coat and kind of in our memes. I do think people talk about these trends quite a bit, and kind of all the time, sometimes in funny ways, sometimes in memes and Reddit threads, and other times through anger. But they just don't always use those words necessarily. They're not upset about private equity gobbling up vet clinics. They're upset that their vet bill is more expensive than it used to be, right? So again, matching the problem or the ways that people experience this in Canada is different than the kind of reality of corporate concentration, but also the ownership of these firms changing. Do you really want to talk about supply management though, or are you just gesturing at it?
I mean,
I get $1 every time someone asks us about it, so I'm making out like a bandit.
I mean, I've been obsessed with supply management for a long time, but I think if we go down that rabbit hole, someone will throw a shit.
We're gonna get kicked off the stage if we do that.
We're gonna get
Did you
taken
want
up
to
by
follow
Big
up on
Gary.
me? Yeah,
Vass almost wore her Loblaws shirt tonight, but
yeah.
she
Denise
decided
talked
again.
me out of it. Yeah.
Well, but it is really striking, though, that oftentimes in this country, we often do have this illusion of competition that you mentioned off the top. The fact that there are so many different brands that are owned by the same company, the fact that there are these same pricing structures and pricing models and prices at the end of the day that are running across a bunch of different brands that look independent and different, in some cases are run by grocery stores called independent,
That always cracks us up.
Yeah.
not independent.
Independent grocer. What?
Yeah.
Owned by Loblaws.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that illusion of competition, and doesn't that sort of stymie the conversation and leads to us kind of going off vibes and memes more than the reality of putting on the table that, hey, listen, we don't have a lot of real competition in this country?
Yeah. Can we tell you our favorite analogy that we came up with while we were writing this book? Are there any professional wrestling fans in the house? I know this is the right crowd to ask that question. Okay, so as you can tell, Vass and I are huge fans.
It's obvious.
So in professional wrestling, I think most of us are aware that there's characters, right? People put on personas. They have these epic battles that are sort of fake. They're predetermined. There's all these elaborate storylines, and it's very rare for the wrestlers to break character. It's sort of like breaking the fourth wall in acting. And there's a term for it. It's called kayfabe, and it's the illusion of rivalry. So it's when wrestlers pretend to be rivals, but actually, backstage they're buddies. And we thought that was the perfect analogy for how markets operate today. So we say that we're living in the age of kayfabe capitalism, which is that there's this illusion of competition. And as Justin was mentioning, I mean, if you go to the grocery store, we all know No Name and President's Choice are private label products that the grocery stores own. But there's actually, tons. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of others that we may not be aware of. They're also owned by the grocers. Or, one of our other favorite examples is if you go into the mall and you go to Sunglass Hut and you see Prada, Gucci.
That's Temu.
Yeah, exactly. Making up a new brand, trademark. You see, Ray-Ban, you see all these different sunglasses or different eyewear brands, and you think that when you choose one of those or the other, you're supporting one company over the other. But in fact, they're all owned. All of those brands are owned by the global eyewear monopolist EssilorLuxottica, and they've also vertically integrated, so they don't just own all the brands and the glasses, but they also own Sunglass Hut. So they earn money on all the dimensions, and that's another one of those sort of illusion of rivalry things where you see a what's the word? The
Proliferation.
Thank you. Proliferation of brands, and you think you have all this choice, but actually it doesn't really matter what you choose at the end of the day because your money's going to the same place.
Can I just chase? Can I say the thing about ketchup? Who here likes ketchup? Just kidding. Justin's like, I'm losing them. Wrestling, ketchup. But there's this. So often we talk about these digital companies, like Denise was mentioning Amazon, right? You both own and operate in the very same marketplace. So for the privilege of competing, you're up against that company that knows. It knows if your product's popular. It knows where people are who are buying it and how often and how much, et cetera, et cetera. And this happens in grocery, right? So Loblaw, which we keep mentioning, noticed that people weren't switching away from Heinz to their no-name brand. They were offering 3 different ketchups. So instead of making a better ketchup or pricing their ketchup more competitively, they just kicked that ketchup out of the marketplace entirely. And that's part of that kind of new market power, right? When you have created the marketplace and you've set the rules and you make the rules in your favor. Again, is that an absence of regulation? No, it's a highly regulated space, but the rules are made by that private company.
It's 2050. You can choose between President's Choice ketchup and President's Choice catsup, and that's it. Listen,
I'll take the cookies.
a lot of the problems you were talking about in your presentation are incredibly technological and they're incredibly American, right? I mean, whether it's Amazon, whether it's ChatGPT and OpenAI, many of the emerging tech monopolies, AWS being another prime example, so much of our internet infrastructure runs on AWS from Amazon. What do we do with that? I mean, when the oligopoly is not even within our borders, how can Canada ever hope to break it up, to foster competition in a smaller market? You know, how do you overcome that behemoth that is so beyond our control?
I mean, one of the things we want to bring forward in the book is how these strategies and tactics established by the largest technology companies are actually being replicated by firms of all sizes and are present in our backyard, right? Again, you don't have to be the biggest player to kind of have market power or exert that power. And the longer we have a kind of regulatory silence, right? Politically, it was momentarily popular to talk about gatekeeping, for instance, right? Which many of these largest firms do. We didn't actually talk about how firms gatekeep access to markets. Here, we haven't had a conversation about business behaviors outside of, you know, in order to abuse your dominance, you have to assert it. And sometimes the cases that we see in Canada are kind of remarkably, I mean, I don't want to say provincial because the provinces are important. That was a slide of ours. But, you know, recently when the Competition Bureau had this, I think, incredible, really important ruling with Cineplex, and that ruling was about $1.50. And they said, hold up, this is false and misleading advertising. You're saying that the price of a movie ticket is, say, $10 when you book online, but it's impossible to actually book that ticket unless it's $11.50. Is that $1.50 breaking people's backs? No, but it's the principle, and it sent a signal of what the Bureau cares about. I'll turn it to Denise in a second, but maybe one of the other elements that has held the Bureau back is their powers. And whenever I say that, I think of like superhero powers. But over the last couple of years, there have been a series of historic legislative changes to the Competition Act. But the Competition Act is not the only instrument that we have to regulate markets. And part of why we've been quieter or less thoughtful in Canada is because we haven't re-articulated what our vision is for the role of the state in those markets. And when Google was recently found to have illegally obtained its monopoly through a US case, Canada had done a similar investigation a couple of years ago. And sorry that I'm going to laugh. I think it's just what I do when I'm like sad about a fact I'm going to say. Our conclusion was, sorry, we can't figure it out because we don't have enough information. And that's kind of crazy when you put it in comparison because it's not a Canada-specific problem, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer your question about the sort of US-Canada dynamic, I think, for one thing, Canada should welcome a more interventionist antitrust regime in the US because that only benefits us. So, you know, send love letters to Lena Khan if you can at the Federal Trade Commission. But, increasingly international regulators are coordinating on cases, so they might share information on merger cases or on investigations where it's permissible to do so. And we do see more alignment actually between Canada and the US on their approach. For essentially for the last 40 years, we had this very dormant regulators because it was the paradigm, right? Starting with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, he said, the scariest words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And, and I think while of course we see abuses of power come in all shapes and sizes, and the government is not immune. But when we took this orientation that government should just get out of the way and that markets would self-correct, we really abdicated our responsibility for, properly governing markets. And so now you've seen a total shift where, under the Biden administration, under this government, through the Competition Bureau, there's a real revival of, competition policy enforcement. And we think that's really important. And I had something else I wanted to say, but I've totally lost it.
Well, but let me ask you though, because I don't think you say this in the book, but I don't want people to get the impression that this just sort of happened. I think in the book you very cleverly write the line, the markets are not natural, they are created. Canada wanted to have oligopolies, right? I mean, it was a strategic decision we made that we were going to protect our dairy farmers. We're towing the line there, that we only wanted a few telcos because we wanted them to build the infrastructure so we could have, internet and phone everywhere. We were only going to have 2 railway lines. We were only going to have, X number of healthcare companies. How do you change that paradigm now? Or are we still kind of latently believing that we need to minimize the number of corporations in this country so that we can force them to deliver the things we want?
I remembered my other point, which was which was a public competitor in the mix, which is also, so Canada has also, I think, much more so than the U.S., been, had a history of having crown corporations and other publicly owned corporations which can act as competitors and sort of, at least set a baseline for markets in different ways. And we, and we're seeing that also in tech, where there is government, spending on satellite infrastructure, as an example. So, so I think that's another component. But yes, what was your other question?
Geography being our destiny.
Geography.
We're so
Oh,
small,
national
we need
champions.
national champions.
Yeah. So do we want national champions? So my perspective on this is it's complicated, but that often when we talk about national champions, we have to make distinguish between, well, are these things that are traded globally? Are these global supply chains, or are they just national? And if they're just national, then there's no reason to have national champions necessarily, because they don't need to compete abroad. And so, I think as we see with roll-ups with vet practices and so on and so forth, those are not things that are going to be, competing internationally. And you saw this also in Europe. There was a train merger that was proposed, and the 2 European train companies were saying, you have to let us do this. We have to grow to compete with China. And when the competition regulators looked into it, they said, less than 2% of your competition comes from China. They're not here. There's no Chinese trains in Europe. Nice try. And so I think you often see these arguments where it's a sort of attractive argument. We need to get big so that we can compete internationally. But I think the devil's always in the details.
What is the role for a public option, though, for crown corporations, for quasi-public companies? I mean, we've certainly fallen away from that. Is there still a world where we want to have a via rail, a public banking option? Postal banking has been thrown around a lot over the years. Is that an avenue to actually force competition, or does it further entrench the idea that there should only be a handful of companies in any given market?
I mean, a public competitor can help anchor and sort of keep competition in check. You see people calling for this a little bit more with telecom, right? So we see more municipal broadband. We actually, to your earlier point of markets being made and remade all the time, it's possible, right? And we're kind of getting there incrementally. I think in the future, people might be surprised that Canada doesn't have a public competitor in the, I'm going to be boring for a second, permission granted, low Earth orbit satellites, right, are a place that we actually allow plenty of competition in Canada, plenty of foreign competitors too, mostly one owned by Elon Musk. And how is that going to introduce a new fragility for us? Is that good from a national security standpoint? Now, our government has very heavily subsidized a Canadian firm, Telesat, right? But again, this is a conversation about how and where should the state, or making sure that there's a Canadian competitor kind of in that mix as a market is made, as a market is sort of remade. And I think you might see more in telecom. We recently had a pretty big decision from the CRTC. Again, I'm being boring, but I'll stop for my next question, where the CRTC is now forcing telecom operators to let all sorts of services use its physical infrastructure. And that's sort of been the by design tension for quite a bit. So again, we wanted to mention public competitors because it's something that historically Canada has kind of gotten right in a very interesting way. And so much of the competition conversation is anchored in how bad we suck and kind of debating over how bad it is. And we do want to shout out the wins to the extent that they do exist.
Okay, I actually want to get even wonkier than that in a second. I'm sorry. But also in just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so, I'm going to open it up to questions. I hope everyone brought along your least favorite uncompetitive industry that you want to talk about. I'm sure there's a long list. So there's a microphone, one over there. I think one over there. Yes, perfect. So rush to them soon. Listen, there's an interesting historical paradigm here. We think of a lot of these problems, these anti-competitive problems, as situations where there's sort of limitless infrastructure, right? Like sending satellites to space. We think, oh well, space. There's lots of space.
There is a lot of room up there, but increasingly, no, you're right.
At a certain point, Elon Musk's strategy is send up so many satellites so that no one else can compete, right? Uber. Their strategy was put so many cars on the road and make them so cheap that no one else could conceivably run a ride-hailing or taxi business. This is the same strategies that Standard Oil used in the 20s. This is the same strategies that the Canadian Pacific Railway used, that CN and other rail systems used in the late 19th century. Can we learn some lessons from history, from antitrust measures in the past, in how we can foster competition in the 21st century?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool.
So it was, next question.
Next question.
No, so it was actually so interesting because, you know, Vass and I, this is the kind of stuff we like to do in all our spare times. We went back and we read the parliamentary debates from 1889.
Together.
Because Canada actually has a claim to fame, which is that we introduced the first federal competition law in the world. We beat the US by a year. So the Sherman Act was 1890 and we were 1889. And what was so interesting is that the debates, you can go read them, but we quote them in the book, which is they were talking about the high price of groceries and how the grocers had too much power. They were talking about, should we impose tariffs on the US because, you know, we're worried that they're going to impinge on sort of Canada's market position. I mean, it's all the stuff we debate today. And you know, I think Canada didn't really have like a big trust busting era like the US did, where you know, you really saw a really aggressive period of breaking up companies, breaking up Standard Oil, trying to break up Microsoft, you know, in the early 90s and so on. But we can absolutely learn from that. And that is that, you know, monopolists, their strategies never change. I mean, they do the same things, right? They try to win the market. They impose these tolls. They tie their products, and so on and so forth. But the tactics that they use, of course, change constantly. And those are the things that are harder and harder to keep up with because markets are changing so quickly today, and because of digital markets, the tactics they can employ are sort of like seemingly endless. So yeah, there's a lot that we can learn from history, and we can realize that actually we've been here before, and we have curtailed market power in really important ways that did unleash innovation, that made things fairer for workers and consumers. And those are the lessons that we do try to draw from.
So what? I'm going to try to make this my last question. So consider yourselves unleashed. What powers do we give the Competition Bureau to change this, to encourage this competition, to punish uncompetitive behavior? Just briefly, you tell the story in the book of it. I think is it a bar owner, a barbecue owner, the guy who at the point of sale system who's getting literally
Montreal
fined?
restaurant.
Yeah, it's Montreal. So tell me about that, and tell me about how we can fight back and foster competition and entrepreneurship again.
Okay, I'll just tell the story really quickly. So there's a restaurant here in Montreal I looked it up. It looks like they have a great steak and a really great pie. It's called Gus. And the restaurant owner was talking about how they used Lightspeed for their point of sale system in the restaurant. And he all of a sudden started, getting $200, $300 charges per month. And he thought, well, what is this about? And he called them up and they said, oh, well, unless you also use this other service that we provide, it's expensive for us to service your account, and so we're just going to charge you this. And this is illegal in competition law. I mean, that's tying. And they were essentially imposing on him that you have to buy all of your services from us or we're going to fine you. And so that's just one example of, again, this sort of like market power issue.
Oh, but you want how the Bureau can kind of take that on?
If it's illegal, then why are they still doing it?
I mean, sometimes people point to the big debate in Canadian competition used to be, is the act sort of dusty and just kind of out of date? Or is it actually super flexible and awesome and we just under enforce it, right? And even with these changes, I think that's going to persist because of how pervasive these challenges are and how they're increasingly in every corner of the economy. So the Competition Bureau is in kind of a tough place. It's really minimized. It's nestled within the Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, which creates a natural tension. This is the very ministry that wants companies to kind of grow. So it also receives kind of 2 to 3%. We always say we want someone to fact check us on that, but do we?
Nobody has.
No one has. We're like, we get fact checked a lot by reply guys on the internet, so you can imagine.
That's what they're there for.
Right?
They have a monopoly on the truth.
So again, expanding beyond that policing power, first of all, granting the Competition Bureau more independence, but also maybe more of a coordination function. We have the scaffolding for this whole of government approach in Canada. We've started it a little bit. The Minister of Finance is taking on banking fees. We're seeing more on junk fees. And again, these interventions aren't kind of revolutionary in and of themselves. They don't really capture your imagination. They don't seem like a big fix, but in aggregate, that kind of radical incrementalism coming together, these changes together, calling on both or all three orders of government and other ministries and sort of identifying tangible and kind of tactical places we can make interventions makes us very hopeful. Now, just before you go to questions.
Can I also
Yeah,
say-
I know.
There is,
yes.
by the way, not enough competition for the microphones already. So there you go.
There's only 2. It's enough.
Oh, I was just going to say, I really love telling this story about Canada because I think it's so important, which is, over the last year and a half, we did pass 3 rounds of legislative updates to strengthen our competition law, and these were passed unanimously through Parliament. I mean, can anyone believe that? Unanimously, not one vote against it. And so there's so much cross-partisan support for this policy area. Vass and I talk to all parties. We advise all parties on this, and they all have an interest because it's just good market governance. And I think that's a story that, needs to be told, especially when trust in government is really low, and it can feel hard to, trust that that we do have the tools and the capacity to deal with these problems. But we think it's such an important time right now to really build on that momentum and to get more ministries involved, get provinces more involved, and to take this agenda forward.